Welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, and this is a special episode of The Journey Home. We're here in Sweden. We're here in the parish offices of St. Erik's Cathedral, Stockholm, and actually this is called Pauli's Summer Palace. It's about 350 years old. It's a wonderful building. You'll see some of the pictures from some of the wonderful artifacts here. We're also next to the cathedral. Behind us, I think it's about maybe 200 years old. I'm not exactly sure, but we're in an absolutely wonderful place. And this morning we had Mass in the crypt of the church, and there was a sense, a feeling that as we're here taping these interviews in Sweden, there's a sense in which we see a breaking forth of the faith in a way that's been maybe hidden away, but that's what you're going to hear in these stories as these men and women share their journey home to the faith here in Sweden. Our first guest is Charlotta Levay. Welcome, Charlotta, to the Journey Home.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you here. And I'm just curious, you're here in Stockholm. Do you live here in Stockholm?
I've just moved from Stockholm, actually, to Lund, which is in the south of Sweden.
So are you familiar with this place that we're taping the program in?
I think I might have been in this part of the building, but most of all I'm familiar with the church.
Yes.
That's where I was brought up, actually, or brought into the Catholic Church.
All right, so this is your home base for your faith.
Yes, it is.
That's right. What I normally do in the Journey Home program is I ask the guest to back up a bit and let the audience know where you've come from spiritually, how you're brought up in the faith. So if I would, Charlotte, why don't you start there and give us a little background?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Sweden by a Swedish mother and a Croatian father. And they brought me up, like I guess most people in Sweden, with going to church perhaps now and then for Christmas and some catechisms, but mostly as non-believers, I'd say.
More cultural?
Yes. And then...
and that would be Lutheran, I wanted to make sure.
Lutheran, exactly,
yes,
in the State Church of Sweden. And then when I was to go to confirmation, I realized that I didn't believe at all, actually, so I didn't want to do it. So I never did. And then as I grew older, I became an explicit atheist. I didn't believe at all. That's the sort of the conclusion that I drew from all the things that I knew. But then later on...
I was going to wonder, is that because the content of your catechesis in growing up just didn't include an explicit expression of the faith, or you weren't hearing, or both and, as you look back on your own?
I think the version of the Christian faith that I encountered when I grew up was a watered down version with lots of no really good explanations for anything. If you had any questions, what you would hear in general would be, well, it's natural to doubt, and it's a good thing to doubt, and you always doubt. And it's like, well, why should you then believe at all? There was no... And I think I would say specifically, there were no sort of intellectual explanations for anything. If you had specific questions about the existence of God or basic things, there were no good explanations, really. They were instead just encouragements to be kind and happy.
So was there an underlying assumption that there was this battle between faith and reason? This is what we believe, but if we're reasonable, I wonder if you were kind of set up for the atheism where you eventually
Yes,
ended up.
I think they had sort of the people who explained faith to me in different ways, explicitly or implicitly, when I grew up. I think they made this difference between faith and the reason. I think they had I think they believed that they couldn't really defend faith with reason, and I think that's a huge mistake.
Yeah.
Because there's no way of taking it seriously if you can't.
Now, what about moral teaching in your catechetical upbringing?
Well, I distinctly remember that one was supposed to be nice.
Okay.
And kind, and think of other people. That's basically
So
it.
kind of the golden rule
Yes.
was the main underlying tenet?
Yes, and I think that also the people I met, for them it was also very important to be nice and kind people. And it was like, we're cozy, we're nice, we're very kind to each other. And also if you could see, for instance, the young, like the teenagers or the youth culture, if there was any, the people who were attracted to church in their teens, it was also like a particular kind of people who liked to be nice and cozy and in small groups playing the guitar. So it seemed more like a very particular lifestyle rather than something for anyone.
If you teach the faith with this presumed division of faith and reason, and your main tenet is be nice, that leads to a hyper-tolerance. So, in other words, you probably didn't talk about your faith with other young people at all. That was something that was more private, if there was there at all.
I think young people in Sweden speak about the faith, but as you speak about anything. Okay. But in Sweden in general, faith has been, it's changing now, but it has been something very private, almost taboo. You don't speak about it in public. It's very sensitive. Yeah.
You're nice. You be nice.
Well, no, it's actually, no, it's true. I mean, it is considered something very private, okay. And it is considered, even people who take it seriously, I think, see it as something you can't just, it's too serious to be talked about lightly, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's not good upbringing, for instance. It's not good tone to talk about it in dinner parties, for instance. You're not supposed to talk about religion. And it's a bit like that. You're not supposed to talk too much about religion.
That's what I meant by, being nice.
Yeah.
If you're being nice as your main tenet, if that's the main tenet of your faith, then you don't dig into areas that are more private. So then it leads to a hyper-tolerance in the culture. And you ended up, the trajectory then as a result of that was atheism. I mean, you're actually an outspoken atheist at one time then.
Yes, I was. Yes.
College, is that where that was mainly?
Well, yes, or what would correspond to high school, college, university, all through these years. I explicitly did not believe in God. Yeah.
Had you made that bold statement to family and parents, and even to the point of just not going to church?
Well, no one else went to church, so that didn't make any difference. But my older brothers and my sister, they went to confirmation, even if they just did it as a rite de passage. You do that.
It's a rite of passage.
Yeah, and but when I was at that stage, I said, no, I don't want to do it because I wanted to be honest and I didn't believe in it. And it was a big problem. Well, it was a problem because my father had already bought me a huge family Bible, this size. So that was, and also I think he was a little sad, but in general it was accepted, that I didn't do it. Yeah. All right.
Did that atheistic conviction then shape the direction you took in college and your studies and your view of the world and the direction you took in your life at the time?
Well, yes, that was I think I was a cultural relativist or a moral relativist, and I think I had I guess I also took some pride in this. I think I saw myself as quite smart, I was smart enough to find out that, to look through all those stupid things.
Superstitions, you were able to break free from that.
Yes, and I saw it, and there was some pride, but also a lot, I would say honesty, because I wanted to be honest. I didn't want to leave things, just open. I think you would also find a lot of people in Sweden saying, well, I don't believe in God, but I think there is something, they would say vaguely. I think there is some explanation, something. And of course, I think that's basically, it's a good thing because it does mean that you're sort of open. You realize that it's not just the world consists of more things than chairs and tables. Yeah. But it's also a very sort of an easy thing to say. And I didn't want to go for easy solutions. I think I've been all my life more of an either or. I've wanted to think things through and be clear about things. Yeah.
My guess is that there are a lot of our viewers who've been men and women of faith all their life, and they can't even conceive of what life would be like to have decided there is no God, and then to try and think out the ramifications of that. They maybe can't even conceive of how you would live without at least accepting that there's something else out there, whether you have a strong faith in God. And I'm wondering, maybe talk a little bit more about that from, if you look back, as you were thinking through the ramifications. Actually, your description of many in the culture is more of an agnostic. They haven't taken an active stand against the acceptance of God, but they think there's something else out there. But that allows them to avoid the strong position against morality or against culture, because they're saying, well, there's something else out there. So I'm like, but you actually said you were an atheist. So you've taken that strong position. If you look back on that time, I mean, how did that then have ramifications to how you understood morality? How had you understood the purpose of the life that you were given? Did you think of life that way? You had a purpose in your life?
Now, I think I saw, of course, that there are human beings that have other dimensions than purely biological or material. I did realize that. Okay. But I think I sort of left it open. Okay, so where does that come from? I didn't, I saw that more like perhaps, we don't know exactly how that came about. But I did, of course, realize that there are depths in humanity and there are depths in life. I did realize that. It's just that I didn't see any reason to anchor it in a God that, the way I saw it, we didn't know anything about, that I saw more as a product of imagination. Yeah.
I would say a large majority of people who are in the agnostic camp, because they can't address that issue, just put it up on the shelf and get on with life. You know, get in your career, focus on life, focus on relationships, focus on people, and leave those big questions kind of in the background. That'd be my guess. Probably how I would have dealt with it. I was in that scientific materialism for a brief period of time in college, but I was so involved with my studies, I never thought about the big questions. Once I thought about the big questions, that brought me back to God. And I'm wondering, what, as you think about now, what started to introduce you to God? Was it what were the issues that started you back to faith?
Of course, there's several steps, but I think one of, maybe the very first step was that I got more conscious about the problems with this relativism. Okay. I got more conscious about good and bad, good and evil. And I think I realized that this way of keeping everything open, and it may be this and it may be that, and it depends on, that attitude, I realized that it's wrong. You can't really have that. And one of the things that I think set off my thinking about it was the war in former Yugoslavia, because of the atrocities that were committed there, and because of, I think, the indifference of the world, and also because of the way people explained it, the way people reasoned about it in relativist terms, that and some of, I don't know, the wrong versions that were propagated about it, made me realize that there is such thing as good and bad, and there is, some things are true and some things are false, and it matters. It has consequences. It's not, you can't keep that open. You can't say, well, it is, of course, that some moral habits and practices maybe are relative. There are, of course, customs and things like that that differ from country to country and from age to age. But there are some things that are just wrong. So I think it was encountering, even if it was only through newspapers and people I met, not personally, but still encountering and thinking more about evil. I think that's what made me think.
Now, Did it particularly touch you because you mentioned the battle in Yugoslavia? I mean, so you have family back in that part of the world. Right?
Yes, my father's from Croatia, and it's not that he talked a lot about this. It's more that it was a reason for me to to try to be better informed, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I did read about it. I did try to get to know about it. I don't know how much people think about it today, but it was such a horrible war, and there were so many versions of it circulating, and I think all those versions made it more difficult for people to take a standpoint. Mm-hmm. And I think for me that was a real. It really made me think about how should I say, that truth matters and good and bad matters. It's not. You can't. It isn't relative. There are absolutes.
And isn't that one of the problems? Is that what you're touching on is you're reading about the war through a medium that is relativistic.
Yes.
That has a whole different opinions on whether it's right or wrong. It's more political at times, the way it's being communicated. Mm. And I think the audience recognizes that regardless of where they're listening from in their own culture. Mm. They may have heard about that war, or maybe they didn't hear about it at all, depending on whether their media thought it was important or not. So you were hearing it, but you were getting a touch of grace to let you see there's something wrong here with this picture. And I love to see the work of grace in that. Out of your conscience, you're recognizing there's a right or a wrong. But did you identify, it wasn't a direct connect, well, there must be a God. You're just recognizing there's something there.
That's the first step, I think. That's what shook me. I think that's what made me question all those things that I had taken for granted. And that's what made me look closer at some of my basic assumptions. And so it made me think all over again about the basic questions in life. And I think, I don't want to generalize, but I think maybe in Sweden and in other parts of the Western world, we do live very protected lives. And if you're protected, if you don't really, for me, I think it was meeting, as you said, those relativistic, the way the media portrayed it, but it was also just thinking about evil. Think that such a thing does really exist. And sometimes that's not always clear. If you're very protected from everything and from the consequences, maybe even of your own actions, if you're very pampered, then maybe you will never realize the acuteness of those questions of bad and good and evil. Yeah.
Did you discuss this with any of your friends? Do they have similar views, or did you find?
I discussed it a lot, and I was really a very obnoxious person at that time, because I didn't, I discussed it in a rude way. I brought it up, in situations where I shouldn't, and I was just generally, horrible. and that's also,
Well, I suppose if you're an atheist, you can be however you are, and who's to say it's wrong? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's kind of like you're recognizing right and wrong, but it takes a while for that realization to come home, to examine your own self, to see if there's a right and wrong about the way that I am. And that you see it now, but at the time you're saying you didn't see it even in yourself at the time.
I think what I saw first was this thing, no, it's not all relative. And then the rest sort of followed. That made me then open for other things that for which I've been more closed before, I think,
Okay, well, what was the next thing that nudged you along? So how long did it take you to move from the realization of right and wrong to a real conviction that there is a...
I think we're talking also about parallel developments here, and maybe I should mention also, what happened then was that when I started to put those questions again, I did actually then turn to the Catholic Church.
All right. Now, why the Catholic Church? I mean, why not back to the Lutheran?
One may ask that. But then that's why I also should mention that I had this also background and I knew about the Catholic Church a bit before, and I had quite, after all, being this relativist and atheist and everything, I did have quite a positive impression actually of the Catholic Church since before, because as I mentioned, my father's from Croatia, and he was brought up in the Catholic Church. His family was very devout, especially on his mother's side, and I had met them before, and they had, from them I think I had a quite positive image of the church. I had seen already that for them religion was something different than it was for people in general, I think, in Sweden. And also I knew some other people, some friends and acquaintances that were Catholic, and they also were somehow, I think, different from other religious people that I knew. They were more like anybody. It wasn't a particular lifestyle choice. It could be people of all types and kinds. And so I guess I had a quite positive image before of the Catholic Church. And I guess I also had some sense that there were more careful explanations of how things work, that maybe there you could get some answers to questions that are more tricky.
You use the word maybe, and it seems that the emphasis there is that your own Lutheran upbringing, you had not experienced a catechesis that clearly explained your faith, but through the witness of your grandparents, you sensed in their authenticity of their faith that they might have.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? You hadn't received any catechetical training on what Catholics really believe, except you saw the reality of it in your grandparents' lives. Is that what you're saying, is the seed that was planted way back when you were a child that was now starting to ripen?
Yes, that was very important. Yes. It's difficult to say exactly also. I might also, have read things or have had a general impression that you could be more reasoned about your faith and believe. I'm not sure, but definitely those people that I had met were very, very important.
All right.
Because what I had seen in them was, lots of different things. As I said, in my grandmother and her family, I could just see that for them, faith was a source of happiness. It was, for them, it was something nice in their life. I think in the Church of Sweden, faith was something very serious and heavy. It was something that you would sort of, you really need to be careful about those things, But for them, faith was a joyous thing. So that was important. So definitely it was something that was sort of in the back of my mind.
Another thing the audience might not realize is, what about the atmosphere here in Sweden in your lifetime? Is there a more openness to the Catholic faith? I know historically there wasn't. Is there more openness that enabled you to be more open?
Until very recently, there were very strong feelings against the Catholic Church in Sweden, which was anchored in a strong Christian belief. So it's people being quite attached to their faith and having some prejudice then against the Catholic Church. Now, with more secularism and pluralism, there is more tolerance and openness towards the Catholic Church. But I guess there's also much more ignorance about Christianity in general. So it's a mixture. People are more open, but then also they might be open to anything, Buddhism, and whatever.
I noticed right down the street here, there's a mosque.
There is a mosque right here, yes.
So there's openness to a great variety of things as a result of that tolerance.
Yes, well, yes, there's immigration and with people. I would say actually there's not much openness to Islam.
Okay.
That's the exception.
All right.
People aren't very open.
You have the immigrants, though, freely able to live by their faith.
Yes.
in this environment, which would not have been true for Catholics 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
100 years ago, no. Okay. And as late as I think in the 40s, you couldn't be a professor at the university and be a Catholic. You had to belong to the Lutheran Church. You may want to check that as a fact statement, but I think it was quite late actually. And still, our king and the royal family, they are obliged to belong to the state church.
Oh, okay. Similar in other countries from our viewers. England is a similar environment. Why don't we take a break, Charlotta, and we'll be back just a moment to hear the rest of Charlotta Levay's story. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. We're coming to you from Stockholm, here in the parish offices of St. Eric's Cathedral. And these, as I mentioned earlier, these offices are a part of a summer palace that's 350 or so years old. So it's a wonderful environment here to do our taping. And our guest is Charlotta Levay. And Charlotta, thank you for summarizing your journey so far. It's hard to take a whole life and condense it into an hour. But we left where you had talked about an awareness from your life experiences, first of the reality of good and bad evil, that I'm assuming that your compatriots here in Stockholm didn't exactly share. They hadn't all come to that realization. But also you were talking about the seeds that had been planted in your life by the witness of your grandparents and even friends. And I want to go back there just a little bit more because I want our audience to recognize what important part that played in awakening your heart to the Catholic faith. Because your grandparents probably didn't realize what their witness had done in opening you to the faith.
I think perhaps most of all, my father perhaps didn't realize because he is himself, he doesn't believe in God, but he's very Catholic in his views, he's a cultural Catholic, I'd say, and very probably influenced by his upbringing with, particularly on his mother's side, a very religious and pious family. And so in lots of things that he has told about the family and about the lives that they led, about how they made their choices, about the values that were important, I think that has somehow transmitted and given me a sense of an example, actually. I still think quite a lot about my grandmother and her sisters, about the stories I've heard of them from a different time, a different life, when other things mattered. And just to take a small example of the stories he told of one of my grandmother's sister, she's dead now, but when she was old or retired, she got to know that the house where she had lived all her life, she had no property rights to it, which can be somehow, I guess, a shocking experience for people. Yeah. But what she did, she fell on her knees and said, "Thank you, Lord, for making me poor as you." And that's the kind of stories that, at least, that I was brought up with. So even just those stories of people that concern you make you think. Yeah. It's so completely different from what you the rest of the thing you hear about, how people make their choices, what people care about. And there are lots of other stories like that. And I guess maybe from a culture where family matters, from a culture where you do tell stories about the family. So I think my father has transmitted that. And also, I guess, in his own thinking. When he, for instance, wants you to apologize for something, I mean, once he even wrote a list of conditions for being forgiven for something particularly serious offense to me and my brothers and sister. And then he actually, it was like, that was a small catechism, because it was like, okay, first you need to realize that you did something wrong. You need to be sorry about it. You need to be prepared to do amends, etc. So it was like, so I think maybe somehow my mind was prepared in a way for the more formal teaching than about sin and forgiveness.
Well, you mentioned the strong statement that your father, though a Catholic, calling himself Catholic, himself probably did not believe in God, but yet, even there, the witness of his convictions of right and wrong planted seeds in your conscience that were there. And these are all wonderful messages to our audience when we think about bringing up our children, our grandchildren, this wonderful story about the attitude of thankfulness that your grandmother expressed. I mean, that is such an important attitude to all of life when you face crucial issues, that in the midst of that, yet you being thankful for what you have or what you are.
Yes, I think that has also made me think about how everything you do in life, it sends a message, and you don't know who's ever going to receive that message. It's what you do in your life, and as avowedly my grandfather said on his on his deathbed. You say that on his deathbed. He said to his children that I've been talking even when I've been silent, saying that everything I did in my life was to show you how I think, what matters, what is important in life. And obviously that's the way we should think of how what we do is, and our attitudes. There's always somehow someone watching. It does make a difference, even if you don't know, and even if you will never know in your own lifetime. It's so important. What you do yourself, even almost in your inner mind and in private, it does matter to other people. We're all connected in that way.
Well, as a result of the witness and the seeds planted both by your father and your grandparents, you have this awakening to right and wrong, and then an interest in the Catholic faith. But you can still have that and be a bit detached. At what point do you become engaged in the Catholic faith?
I started going to those courses with introductions to the faith, and there I was very impressed actually and attracted by. It was quite important to me that there were sort of a good reasoning, a sound reasoning about it, that logic wasn't forbidden, that there was an intellectual tradition, that if you had questions, very specific and sometimes even, stupid, basic questions, there were explanations. That was very, very important to me because it showed me that this is something that people take seriously. It's not just a figment of their mind. It's not something that they make up to comfort themselves. No, this is serious. They take it seriously. So for me, it then became a serious option. But then I think, and then I did go to see a priest for a few times. And of course, I think it was in those conversations, some of the things he said, some of the things that made me start thinking about it, realizing that that this respect for truth that I think I somehow had before, it was actually a respect for God, and that also a realization that that the evil that I had encountered in the world, that I've all started to think about, it was something that I could also have part in, that I wasn't such a great person that I had thought. That was also, I think, a very, very important issue, that I'm sort of part of the problem, that the problems of the world are not, I can't sit on the side being detached from it and think about it philosophically. I'm part of it all, and I'm part of the problem, and I need to that confrontation was also, I think, a moment of truth, and I realizing that that was also an encounter with God, you know, to see things that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, St. John in his first letter, which is a part of the daily readings today, express almost the self-realization of the fact that you've been touched by God is when you realize you've been touched by God. You see yourself differently.
Yeah.
And even as you expressed that you used to have a certain attitude about truth and the way you would hit people with your opinions, but you came to a realization that, well, that's not exactly right. So you're starting to be changed by grace yourself.
Yes, and obviously if you have a relativist mindset, you don't need to think very carefully about the bad things you've done in life. But if you start thinking more carefully about it, then those things, you know, become more pressing. And I think at that point it was, I did change the way I looked on myself and the world also. Definitely, that was a very important part, I think, of that journey we're talking about, realizing my own weaknesses, my own faults, basically repenting somehow.
Yeah, it's a necessary part of the journey.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very. I remember. I mean, precisely that conversation. Those days when I realized, there's something wrong here, and it's not just wrong with the world; it's wrong with me. You know, it's.
Well, as you went through that training, of course, you started encountering aspects of the Catholic faith that were a whole lot different than your Lutheran upbringing. Not just because you may not have been trained well, but now all of a sudden there's confession, there's the sacraments, there's teachings about Mary, there's other theological differences. How did you deal with those in your journey?
Well, I think, there were lots of things like that to think of, and I think particularly about the role of the church as an institution, and the role of sort of having all those dogmas and being expected to believe in them. And I think that was even before my conversion. I bought this, it's a book this thick by Karl Orff, summarizing the most important dogmas.
It's still that thick.
And it's quite interesting reading, and also if you've got problems falling asleep, it might also help a bit. It's very interesting, but somehow tiring as well. And it's so there are lots of things you're expected to suddenly believe in, but I think for me it wasn't any particular singular explanation. It was more a sense that when I had questions, you could really get explanations. I did have the privilege of having good teachers at that point, several, and also I think well-informed friends. So I could talk, more informally with them, who knew a lot about those things, and who would explain things in very good ways. Also very theoretically and factual, they could give explanations. And that was very important, I think, to encounter those people as well. But and then after a while, I think I sort of get a sense of security. Okay, if I have questions, there are answers, and there is a discussion going on, and this discussion has been going on for 2,000 years. I'm not the first one who's thinking about this, so it's sort of I can relax. I don't have to scrutinize everything, every single paragraph in every single statement that any pope has made, because I can have a general sense of confidence in the whole process. Okay, so we've got lots of smart people who've been thinking about those things. They've had church meetings quarreling about it, and this has been going on for centuries. And maybe I'm not the smartest in this whole group.
And the audience, we need them to understand you have a PhD in business, and you teach business organization. Yeah. And I'm thinking the way you're describing how you're drawn to the church, it's very order of this, it makes sense, it fits together, which impressed me too when I came to the faith, that the Catholic faith, even though just a summary is that thick, yet it fits together.
Yeah.
There's an order, it's reasonable, it makes sense. It doesn't mean that you look at a difficult doctrine like the Trinity, or the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist, still takes the faith to recognize, but there's a reason behind the things that we believe. And I love that, as our recent Holy Father John Paul had emphasized so importantly, the
Yes.
relationship between faith and reason.
And I think maybe the closer you come to faith, maybe those things matter perhaps less and less, because that's not really the core of the faith. But I think those questions sort of about logics and intellectual matters, they can be a stumbling block. So it's very, very important to have that reasoning, and it's important not to forget it, because when people put questions to you, it can be about those things.
Well, wouldn't you say probably, if you forget those, then you end up like maybe where your father ended up, in Catholic name only, but not knowing the faith very well. Talk a bit about the actual coming into the church. Was that a big event for you? Or?
You mean that day? And yes, of course it was. It was in this church. It was on the day of the Holy Heart of Jesus. Is that the way you say it? No, the confession was on that day.
Okay.
And the reception, so to say, it was the First Communion. It was on the day of the Immaculate Heart of Saint Mary. And yes, it was. I was nervous in a way. I think that I'm not usually in public situations. It was like, I don't know. It was, and my mother was there, and my father had sent me flowers, which was nice because I knew then that he was happy for it.
Yes.
Yes, it was. Well, maybe I am Swedish also in that way that when you come to the deepest feelings, maybe it's also difficult to talk about.
Express.
It's not so easy to express, I guess.
All right. Well, your vocation, you teach in business, but you also on the side find yourself in a bit apologetic areas. Talk to the audience a bit like that, because you've been in the press defending issues of the faith, isn't it?
Yes, I've been working a bit like a bit as an opinion journalist, and I still write, columns, commentaries. I sometimes participate in debates and in television, and on those occasions, I sometimes the issue is about morality, and I think it's. I think I then have the opportunity to present things that are sort of unheard of for a Swedish audience, because there is such a very sort of politically correct. It's weighs so heavily on the public debate in Sweden that there are some things that are just taken for granted, and there are some things that you don't talk about. There are taboos, and there are so just with very basic, I think, understanding of some of the things that I think are very intensely discussed in the United States. If you just have a small knowledge about that, you can make a huge impact, I think, in Sweden.
I would say that, especially from the United States perspective, often when we think of Sweden, we think about the sexual freedoms that have become such just an accepted part of Swedish culture. Now, is that one of those things you just take for granted, or is that one of those things you don't talk about in Swedish culture, or both and?
It's a mix, I think. For instance, it is taken for granted that the sexual revolution was a good thing, and that abortion should be allowed, that sexual liberty is a good thing for women, and so on. That it has to do with women's liberation. There are lots of things like that are taken for granted. But it's also taboo in the sense that you can't really talk about openly about abortions, about the consequences for women, about the consequences for society. It has been for quite a long time, I would say, an area where only one opinion is allowed. It's slowly changing though. I think it's getting now. It's opening up a bit. You can actually talk about it a little bit more freely, which is important, I think.
Well, as you are what you're saying then also is that you have broken through some of those areas and actually speak the teaching of the church on some of these areas. Are you received well?
Yes, I think I am, because
Are you giving women courage to join you in that position?
I don't know if I am. It's just that I think that I think when I discuss those things, I'm sort of careful not to try to be not too aggressive, which is very easy to be when you believe something strongly. I try to rather sort of invite people to think about things in a new way, and people are interested in it. And I think there is, as I mentioned the word politically correct before, and I think there is sort of a received opinion about this that doesn't really correspond to what people in general feel. I think people in general are much more open-minded and do know from their own lives that those things aren't completely unproblematic. So if I say things in TV or in an opinion piece, people think, yeah, well, it's not, yeah, actually she's got a point there. And even if they don't agree completely, they are open. And I do get, thank you notes and people who are grateful and people who say, it's quite important what you said there. And it's, so I think there is an openness among people in general, I think.
Well, your own experience of realizing the right and wrong just from your own conscience, even though you weren't believing in God at the time. Where we're staying in our hotel is just a block away from here. And I arrived on Friday night late. I got to the hotel 1 a.m. And the streets were full of people. Saturday night, full of young people. And I was thinking, as I looked at that, that's the children of the sexual revolution. So as you look at your culture now, you're looking at these young people who are the second generation of that.
Yes.
I mean, how do you see the status of things here in Sweden as a result of that?
How I see it?
Yeah.
I think that young people today, unfortunately, not all of them have a very strong sense of their own value. I think maybe they're a bit reckless with themselves and with one another. But I do think that they also have an openness for something different, a longing, and precisely because they see the consequences of this in their own lives and in the life of others. For them, I think freedom, when it comes to lifestyle, it's not something new, it's not a promising, it's a sort of dreary reality, if you see what I mean. It's something that's always, all options have always been open. No one has ever told them, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, or not very strongly at any rate. They've always been told that everything is open, you could do anything you like. And I think maybe very early on in life, they realize that if nothing matters, well, then nothing matters. Then it's not very interesting either. It's not very important either. They realize, I think, they can become, I think, quite disillusioned quite early on in life. And among the people who agree with me when I say things that aren't very often said in Sweden in the public debate, among those people are quite often young people who've just simply had enough.
Yeah. I think that's the sense in which why conversions like yours are very timely.
Yeah.
I mean, truly, very timely. You had talked about being brought up in a sense where maybe the main morality was be kind, which can often express itself as being hyper-tolerant. Well, the scriptures talk about speaking the truth in love, and that's might include kindness, but love is a real caring for another person to help them understand what's true in a gentle way. And I think a conversion like yours at this time is very timely. Let's say that we've got some people watching us who are right now where you were. What would you like to maybe say to them as words of encouragement for their own journey?
I would like to say, be very careful to keep your sense of truth, of honesty. And if you follow honestly the truth, then you will find your way home. And take your time, There's one direction, there is one God, and as long as you keep that direction in your life, you will end up in the right place.
Might even encourage him to consider prayer, talking to that God up there that is our great loving Creator.
I think pursuing the truth, that is a prayer.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Which it was for your own life.
Yes.
You didn't realize it at the time, but now as you look back.
As I said, I think as a personal advice from me specifically, I think that this the importance of truth, and how that is so intimately connected with God, that if you're honest, if you're faithful to the truth, you're also faithful to God, and that may help you in the most diverse situations, I think.
All right. Charlotta, thank you very much for your witness and for joining us on the journey home. And thank you all.